Hi, Jonathan. We're now live on our lunchtime in conversation. And hello to our audience. I'm really sorry if anyone joined us at midday expecting to see us. Unfortunately, we had a bit of a technical issue there with YouTube and our internet connection, but it appears to be solved now. So I'm delighted to be here today in conversation with Jonathan Davidson. Thank you, Jonathan, for joining us for this in conversation. It's lovely to have you here. I thought it would be great to talk with you a little bit about your book, Commonplace, which is being published by Smith Doorstop Books from the poetry business in August, which we're really looking forward to. And thank you very much for being a participant in our lunchtime conversations, which are sort of designed to be, just going to mute myself as well. Bear with me 1 second, because I can hear myself also just there. So I'm just going to close that for now. Sorry about that. We're just having a few technical hitches there. All sorted. Jonathan, would you like to tell us a little bit about A Commonplace and the book, where the idea originated, what the idea is behind it? It would be great to learn a little bit more about it, because it's not a typical poetry book at all, is it? It's something that is very rich and varied in the way that you've created it.
Yes, I'd love to tell you about it, and I hope it isn't an orthodox poetry book. I've written some of those, and I read many, and I enjoy them. But I found myself drifting away from the orthodox in the last decade of my life, or the most recent decade of my life. I'm in good health. So what it is a book of poetry and a book of commentary. It has poems of my own, 30 or 40, I forget how many, and then a dozen poems by other poets that I admire and enjoy and have read. And then it has a commentary running right through the book, introducing my poems, introducing the poems by the other poets I've included. There are many footnotes with useful and irreverent and irrelevant detail about things that I would like to tell you about. There's a gazetteer at the end, so people can identify the individual locations in the world that I have spoken about and mentioned. There's a bibliography, including a discography, so you can read the books I read, or look at them at least if you wish. You can listen to some of the music I've listened to. You can go and look at the maps I've looked at. And I did that because I realized that my poems don't just come out of some isolated romantic genius. Sadly, I do not have such a thing. They come out of the lived experience, out of my life. And my life is spent reading poems, and most of the poems I read are not my own. I rarely read my own poems. I read lots of other people's poems. So it seemed logical to put in some other people's poems, because over the last 3 years, they've been with me. And in fact, many of these poems have been with me for 30 or 40 or even 50 years. Also, I realized that although I like the idea that a poem can stand on its own and just be read and appreciated for the sounds and the meanings that it may deliver, I'm conscious that from the minute a poem is written, it starts to decay. It has a kind of half-life, and its resonance will change and probably diminish as time goes on. Now, half an hour is not too long for a poem to decay. It will still be fairly fresh after half an hour. But after a few years, some of the points and notes in the poem will not be relevant unless we can give people some context. So although I want poems to stand on their own, I also want people to have a fighting chance of understanding them. And that might mean just saying, by the way, I was here when I wrote this, or this had happened to me, or you need to know this. Not big things, not major stuff, but stuff which people might get if I was doing a poetry reading and I would introduce the poem and say, you'll need to know this is about my dad. He liked cycling. He couldn't read a map to save his life, etc., etc. So it includes the commentary, but also in the commentary, it allows me to talk about the things that poems make me want to talk about, because again, I don't see poems as being things that stand in splendid isolation. I see them as being part of a dialogue with my internal life and a dialogue with my external life and a dialogue with the wider world. And so the commentary is an expansion of that. So briefly, that's what it is. And I have, as they say in the computer world, beta tested it with people, because I was cautious and concerned that people might feel I was in some way breaking the unknown, the code amongst poets, that you don't say anything about the context, you just give the poem, because then your genius will be revealed. But generally speaking, people felt that it was nice to have me give them a fighting chance of understanding what was going on, to help them get to the poem slightly more quickly than they might have got to had they just been given the text.
It's a really lovely way of opening up poetry as well, isn't it? And it's about this whole thing of living with poems and being a part of your life, which I think is really powerful and something that makes A Commonplace quite a different sort of book, but makes it a very open kind of book. And I love that idea too, about bringing readers in, about talking about the stories behind poems and how they are made. And I don't think we do that enough. So it's brilliant having a book that will open that conversation really for readers in so many ways. And I think also celebrate the ways in which poems are part of the fabric of our lives. They're not just something that exists in isolation to who we are or what happens to us.
Yes, I wanted the poems to be of use for people, not just for immediate pleasure, but to be of some value, either for them to just enjoy the experience of the language and the images and so on, or for them to feel this will be of use to me when I find myself in this situation, or indeed, you know, if I'm looking for a poem to give to somebody else or to share at a moment, then maybe this is the right poem. And in fact, as an extension of that, I've invited a number of friends and colleagues and relatives even to record versions of my poems as audio pieces, which is lovely, and extended the invitation to anybody who wants to record one of my poems in their own voice, because I am aware that to read a poem is one thing on the page, but to speak a poem and to have it pass through your body and to release it yourself gives you a completely different relationship with the poem, and it becomes a much more significant thing to you. It tests the poem to some extent, and poems can fall apart in the mouths of others, but if it survives somebody coming along and reading it themselves out loud, then it is an acceptable poem. So I am encouraging people to send to me their audio versions of the poems of mine they've recorded. Obviously they need to credit me and I'll credit them, and then I'll be putting them on my website and gradually releasing them. So eventually I hope that a whole bunch of strangers will have had the pleasure or otherwise of trying to read one of my poems and to record it and to think about it from the inside of the language rather than from the outside.
It's the physicality of a poem, isn't it? Actually taking on a poem, whether it's memorizing it or reading it, but that physical releasing of it through your own voice is a really powerful thing. And it ties us back into something quite fundamental about childhood and about learning to read and learning to write, and how poems are sort of such a big part of that process when we're very small, that sometimes I think we lose as we get older, or we lose as we become teenagers or young adults, and we hopefully come back to it at some point.
It's such an obvious thing to see how the poem sounds aloud. And recently when I've been reviewing poetry, I have occasionally dropped in a few sentences about how the poems sounded when I read them, which is equivalent to doing a car. I mean, you wouldn't do a review of a car or indeed a bicycle without actually getting in the car or getting on the bicycle to see how it sounded, how it felt. So now when I review poetry books, I tend to say, you know, and I read a few out loud and they sounded good. You know, they handled well in the wet, shall we say, accelerated well up the hill, that kind of thing, which is how I think we should to some extent be judging poems, not how good we think they are, but how they live in the mouths of others and therefore in the minds of others.
The literal grip they hold over us, the way they grip the road, but they grip us as readers, and they grip our memory perhaps too. So what can we expect to find inside The Commonplace? Which poems of both yours and other
okay, well, there are lots of poems about my family and my immediate family. Well, yeah, about my family, more than I'd expected. I'm 56. We start to lose people. My dad died a few years ago. My mum is now very old. So you write about them. You write to some extent about your children as well as they start to leave you. I have also found myself writing poems with historical settings and in the voices of others and about other poems. There are a couple of poems which are about other poems. It seems a little insular to write a poem about somebody else's poem and how much you like it. But that's important to me. There are poems that I've lived with for so long, but it would be strange not to say something about them. So there are some poems about that subject. The poems are generally speaking short. A few go over more than one page, most don't. They are, I suppose, introspective, but occasionally they address bigger issues. I've taken a few swipes at contemporary politics, and I'm interested in historical politics, in the English Civil War and the English Revolution, and so on. So there are issues of those. And I found myself in different parts of the world writing poems. So there are some poems that reflect some of those bits of journeying I've done. At the start of the book, in fact, I write a little note to say where all the poems are written. And they were written in very prosaic places, such as the room I'm sitting in now in Birmingham and in Coventry and in Didcot, my hometown, but also in small towns on the Baltic coast in Estonia and Latvia and in Nicaragua perhaps, and so on. So I've put that in as a note to kind of give people a sense that although they're sitting in one place reading them, some of these poems have had quite a long journey before they get to them.
Thank you, Jonathan. I love, again, that idea of poems, not just that they stay with us, but they journey with us, and that they change, and that they take on sometimes a sense of the place where they are written, that they carry with them in their bones almost a little bit. And we're writing in a strange time right now. We're sort of living through unprecedented times, as so many people have said, and experiencing things that we haven't experienced before in our lifetime. What's it like publishing a book at this time? What are the challenges? What have you found? And how are you getting the book out there into a world where there are no open venues?
Yeah. Well, it's ironic. This is one of the few times I've really taken the promotion of my book seriously. So I spent a lot of time working with my partner, with colleagues from work, and with my publishers, looking at places where I could read, where I could run workshops and so on. I had a whole raft of those lined up. All of them disappeared in the space of a couple of weeks. I'm doing one virtual one with Cork in Ireland, and we've got some conversations like this. So that's been kind of disappointing, because I do know that when stood in front of people, I can convince people sometimes to buy some of my books, and I wanted to do that. But I have, I'm aware that poetry is for the long haul, that poetry books thankfully stay in print for a long time, but they take a while to take off, but sometimes those that take off quickly fall very quickly down to earth, and that those that take off more slowly can have a longer register. So I'm hoping that this book, as with my previous books, will rely on word of mouth of people actually reading the book and actually quite enjoying it, and actually feeling that they could, without fear of revenge, recommend it to somebody else, and it would not be a disappointment for them. So I'm taking a slow approach. We are looking at all the obvious online digital opportunities to have my voice heard. What I am doing, which I hope will be fun for all concerned, is, as I mentioned earlier, inviting people to record some of my poems as audio recordings, and then sharing those audio recordings. This for me is much more enjoyable than sharing my own voice. I would much sooner share somebody else reading my poem, particularly where we have 2 or 3 examples of the same poem being read by different people, just as people will play a piece of music differently, even though the score is the same. So people will approach one of my poems slightly differently or greatly differently, depending, even with the same words. And that's really fascinating. And so I'm going to carry on releasing those in the hope that, people will hear those poems and hear people having a go with them, and will want to come back to the source text in order to allow them in their own parlours of an evening to do a Jonathan Davidson poetry reading without necessity of having Jonathan Davidson present, which many people would say was a boon.
Thank you, Jonathan. That's a wonderful and unique idea. And I think also it's a very generous idea to open your poems out to readers and to literally ask them to read and to contribute. So if anyone wants to do that or wants to listen to them, the place to go, I'm assuming, is your website.
Yes, jonathandavidson.net. And there is a page on there called The Everyday Reader. And you can hear a sample of so far about 41 versions of about 20 of my poems. I've got some more just to upload shortly, and I would be delighted to upload anybody's version. If somebody does a spoken word thrash metal version of one of my poems, I'm prepared to entertain that as well. I really don't mind, as long as we stick to the words, and as long as, they as a performer are credited, and I as the originator of the text am credited, then I'm happy to suspend the normal rules of copyright in order to allow people to enjoy my poems if they can enjoy them, and to have an opportunity to get into poetry from the inside, not reading quietly but speaking loudly.
That's a wonderful idea. And if people want to buy the book as well, if they head over to the Poetry Business website, Commonplace is there and ready to pre-order, or from any of your favourite independent chains. Please do support independent publishing at the moment. That's the end of our lunchtime in conversation. I hope it's been enjoyable for everybody tuning in to talk with us and to have this wonderful conversation about a commonplace with Jonathan Davidson. Thank you, Jonathan, for joining us.
You're welcome.
And this is the end of our lunchtime conversation. Thank you very much to our audience for joining us as well. Goodbye.
Goodbye.